This happened a little over 5 years ago. I was around 12 to 13 when me and my 4 friends, Jenny, Mary, Kelly, and Diana, decided to have a girls' day by going to the mall. Jenny's mom was our ride, and we had a great day shopping and eating at the food court. We were at the mall for around 4 hours, and it was starting to get dark out. Jenny's mom decided that now would be a good time to head home. We all piled into the minivan and started our drive home. We're talking and laughing, a majority of the ride home, when we all get the idea to hang out at Jenny's house, as I had to be home by 9 p.m. and it was only 8 p.m. Mary and Kelly wanted to sleep over, but I couldn't stay the night as I had school the next day. Mary and Kelly's parents were much more relaxed than mine, so they allowed it. Jenny wanted to stop at a store to grab some snacks for her new guests, so we decided to stop at a Dollar Tree. We parked, hopped out, and started walking towards the entrance. I have to preface this by saying that behind this Dollar Tree is a big forest with a big hill that leads down to us along with a park. We were oblivious to our surroundings as we were walking our way to the doors when all of a sudden we all stop. We all heard a weird noise. It sounded almost like a seagull or something. We all live in a peninsula beach town, so we are used to seagulls squawking. But we were in the next town over, which is a forest town that's covered in trees, so there would be no seagulls flying around here. We all try to adjust our ears to the noise, and it keeps on repeating. It seems to be getting a little louder, too. Simultaneously, all of our blood drains from our bodies when we hear a woman scream, "Help me! Help me! He's after me! He's after me!" We couldn't see the woman anywhere. We all turned in circles trying to find her, but it was no use. She was nowhere in sight. We realized that she was behind the store, possibly running down the big hill from someone or something. Our feet were glued to the pavement as we didn't know what to do, so we just listened. The screaming carried closer and closer to the back, and eventually we realized she finally managed to get behind the store. She was so close we could all hear her panting and screaming. It was absolutely terrifying. My stomach dropped to my hips and I couldn't breathe. She lets out one more Blood Mary scream, but halfway through it cuts off and she goes completely silent. We heard heavy footsteps behind the door as we heard what sounded like a man grunting and huffing. And then we heard the sound of tires screeching and a car door opening. A man gets out. "Let's go. Get her in. Get her in here." The car door shuts again and we hear the tires screech away along with the honk of a car horn. This sounds like it took about 5 to 6 minutes in total, but all of this happened in around 50-second max. We were now standing there in front of the Dollar Tree and were in total shock. Did we just hear somebody get kidnapped? We all looked at each other and bolt back to Jenny's mom's car and start explaining everything that happened. We all agree that Jenny's mom calls the police and that we wait until they get there. We still needed to go and get snacks, so we head into the store, pick up some snacks. Along the way, tell some employees our story and book it back to the car. I don't know if the cops ever arrived because we ended up leaving because Diana was supposed to get home by 8 p.m. and it was now 8:15. She called her parents when we arrived at the Dollar Tree to tell them that she would be a little bit late home. They did end up being mad at her. We all arrived back at Jenny's house and proceed to talk about what just happened until my mom pulls up. I explained the whole story to her and she is just as shocked as me. After this incident, we all tried to research any persons or kidnapping stories in the local news, but nothing was ever found or broadcasted. I am now 17, almost 18 in a couple of months, and leaving for college in 5 months. I'm going to college in a different country, so I'll be very far away from home. I'm going to college in a different country, so this story kind of sticks with me whenever I'm alone or walking home at night. And I hope that I or anyone else doesn't have to witness anything like this again. My school is of the only schools in the area that accept kids with autism. I have no problem with these kids. They're mostly pretty nice and pleasant people to be around. I will call this kid Wyatt for privacy reasons. Wyatt is one of these kids with autism, and he is terrifying. At first I didn't have any classes with him, but I knew who he was because he always sat at my table with me and my friends. Until the semester changed, and so did our classes. I have him in my English and science class now, and he does some pretty terrifying stuff. I'll tell some of these stories. Now, the first story happened in my English class. I was forced to pair up with him for a partner thing. I was doing some of the drawings on the poster, and he asked me, "Is it creepy to stare at people and think about watching them through their window at night?" I froze and slowly looked up at him. "Excuse me?" I asked. At this point, I was really uncomfortable. "Is it creepy to want to watch someone sleep?" I, for some reason, thought maybe if I answer, he'll stop. "Yes, Wyatt, that's very creepy." I shifted in my seat and went back to drawing. He just let out a small, "Oh," before beginning to stare at me unblinking until I got too uncomfortable and stood up and then went to the teacher and told him my partner was making me uncomfortable. When the teacher asked why, I told him, and the teacher took him out into the hallway. I didn't see him for the rest of the day. The next story happened in science class when we were playing a game. I don't have time to explain it, but I will say it involved high-fiving people. When the teacher told us that, Wyatt started laughing maniacally, and when I say that, I mean full-out psycho laugh. We were lined up in 2 lines in a parallel formation, and he was across from me and was staring at me the whole time. Everyone around him shifted uncomfortably, and the teacher had to remove him from the class again to get him to stop laughing. I could see through the door with the position I was in and watched as one of the counselors came down and took Wyatt away. He was still laughing. The next story happened in English. We had to write poems that set a mood. I chose to write a sad poem, and the teacher made us all share our poems. When I said mine, which was about a woman crying under a veil, either an unwilling bridesmaid or a mourning woman at a funeral, it was one of those, it's what your mind makes it kind of poems. Anyways, Wyatt looked at me after I had shared and said, "I hope you were in the casket." The teacher didn't seem to hear because I was sitting in the same row as him, and I could hear him whisper. My friend who sits in between us heard it and looked at me nervously. The teacher doesn't really care where we sit, so I silently stood up and shifted away from him. His poem was the disturbing part. I don't remember it word for word, but this is kind of what it said. The body of the girl I had just murdered looked at me with dead eyes, and I proceeded to cut her into tiny little pieces. I shuddered, and the teacher took him out of the class again. I could hear him laughing all the way down the hall to the counselor's office. So I guess I will start off with the backstory of my childhood. I had a loving mother and a brother and a sister. My brother and I are full-blooded siblings, and our sister is only our half-sibling. Now my father, on the other hand, he is a full Filipino, and they don't want girls, they want sons. So when I was born, my father had wanted me dead. He wanted my mother to abort me as soon as he found out that I was a girl. My father had mental issues and was an abusive drunk. My mother, my sister, and myself had to endure daily beatings while my brother was always showered with love. During my school years, I was in search of acceptance from teachers and students. I had friends in just about every group in school. I hid my feelings well and thrived to make others never feel like I did. I had boyfriends, but I was always quick to fall in love. Thankfully, I never went all the way till I was 18, but when I left high school, things got worse. My father died the same year and month I graduated high school. My friends were only my friends because I had money from my dad's passing. During one party, my friends got me incredibly intoxicated and took advantage of me. I was so afraid to say anything to the cops or my mom and stepdad. No one ever knew. I locked myself away and closed off from everyone. Finally, I joined the CCC, California Conservation Corps. You live in the building when you work there. It was a 3-story building with dorm rooms, movie room, game room, cafeteria, offices, and a nurse's office. This building is where I met the one person that would change my life forever, and this is where the story begins. After being in the Corps for a few months, some new recruits came in, and that is when I saw him. He was handsome and strong. We'll call him Lucifer. He had told some of my friends that he thought I was pretty, and by word of mouth, we began to talk. Once we started dating, I started falling like all other relationships before. Too quick. And I had no idea that falling for this guy would end up almost fatal. A few months later, I ended up getting fired for something that would need more explanation, but it isn't important to the story. Having to leave the building because I could no longer live there due to not working there anymore, I ended up in Texas with my grandfather. I had to break up with Lucifer because I had to move so far away. After a few months of living there in Texas, I got a job as a correctional officer at the all-male high-security prison. I was only 19 at the time. I made friends with the guards fast due to them wanting to protect the young, only female officer there. It made me feel better to have so many people behind me and keeping me safe. Shortly after starting there, I got a gift waiting for me at the front door of my grandfather's house. It was from Lucifer. As I opened it, a note at the bottom caught my eye. It said, "Turn around." I turned, and there he was. He had told me that he quit his job to come here to be with me. Now I told him that he could not live here at my grandfather's house. He told me that he had a place to live. He would come and visit after work and hang out. But we never went to his place, which was very weird. After a year of dating, I got my own place and he moved in with me. Only then did he tell me that he had been living in a storm cellar that whole year. Red flag number 1. But as I had said before, I fall hard and early and could not see it at the time. Throughout the next year, we had to move a lot to new places, all because of his temper that I had never seen before. He yelled and punched walls and slowly began to start hitting me too. Red flag number 2. He started hanging out with this couple in the apartments that we were living. They did everything together. They got him into drinking and smoking and who knows what other stuff. After a while, the abuse got worse, and he would call me names and tell me that he was going to cheat on me with his friend's girl. I began to talk to my friends at the prison and tell them that I needed help to leave. Very soon after that, Lucifer's friends were talking about how they had to move, that they wanted us to go with them. I said no, that I wasn't going to leave such a good job. That night, Lucifer made dinner to say that he was sorry and that we would stay. I had made plans with some friends that night to come and get me in the middle of the night and take me away from there. I sat down and ate the dinner he had made, but that was the last thing I remembered, was eating. When I woke up, I was in the trunk of my car. My hands were tied behind my back and my mouth was taped. I tried screaming and kicking, but I was packed into the trunk like I was luggage. The car came to a stop and I heard talking outside of the trunk. I tried moving around and screaming again with no success. The trunk door opened. The sunlight burned my eyes and blinded me for a few seconds, but when I could see again, there stood the 3 worst people I had ever met in my life. They dragged me out of the trunk, and I looked around and there was nothing around us. I thought that he had drove me out into the middle of the desert to end my life. He pulled out a knife and I began to cry, thinking I was about to die. He cut the tape off my hands and told me to keep the tape on my mouth. He walked me to some bushes and told me to go to the bathroom now, and he put a collar and a leash around my neck so that I could not run away. I did my business because I had been holding it for who knows how long. He yanked the leash and dragged me back to the car where he gave me water and more food, which were both drugged, passed back out and back in the trunk. This happened a few more times before we came to the house. It was a big house, 2 stories high and bars on the windows and metal doors. It was night by the time we got there. He pulled me out of the trunk and started to drag me inside. I took this time to rip off the tape and scream for help. Mid-scream, I felt a sharp pain across my face and everything went black. I came to in the basement of the house. No windows, just cement all around me with big wooden pillars around the room. I no longer had tape on my mouth, but I had a metal collar around my neck and a heavy metal chain connected to one of the wooden pillars. There was a small bathroom set up in the corner. It had a toilet, sink, and a big bathtub. No walls for it and no door. In the other corner, there was a mattress there for me to sleep on. I started screaming again, hoping a neighbor would hear me and call the cops. But when the doors opened, it was not the cops that were standing there. I jumped back and as far as I could into the corner. He slowly made his way down the stairs, like he was trying to make me even more scared than I already was. This guy, the guy that was my boyfriend, who I told that I loved once upon a time, he was now my kidnapper, and I had no idea what he wanted from me. He got so close to my face that his lips were touching my ear. He whispered in a low, deep voice, "Do you really think that I would just let you leave me? That I would allow my property to just up and walk out? You are mine, and now you will never be able to leave me again. But don't worry, you will still be making money." And with that, he stood up and walked back up the stairs and slammed the door. What did he mean that I was going to be making money? Little did I know at the time that I did not want to know what he meant. There was a clock beside the bed that read 3 a.m. I could not sleep, I was so scared. I heard footsteps coming towards the door, and without thinking about it, the tears started to flow. I was not ready for him to come down here again. The door slowly opened, but it was not Lucifer standing there. It was a tall man. I could not see his face. I had never seen him before. I started saying, "Help me, please, help me." But as he came down the stairs, I saw his face. He wore a smile across it, and just behind him was Lucifer. He quietly said to Lucifer, "She will do just fine. How much for an hour?" Lucifer replied with, 100. If you like her, you can always come back for more." I was in shock. What was he paying him for? An hour of what? Lucifer said I loved you and walked back up the stairs. The next hour was horrific. I will spare you the details. I will just say that I did not consent. After the man left, Lucifer came back downstairs and saw me laying there, naked, in a weeping heap on the floor. Face was bloody and I was in so much pain that it hurt to breathe. He picked me up and brought me to the bathtub and ran a hot bath and cleaned me up. He explained that if I was a good girl, I would get to eat. The food was almost always drugged, which I began to want. It numbed the horrible thing that I endured. That was my life now. Being chained up in a basement and becoming a punching bag for guys who didn't want to beat their girlfriends, and nothing but a doll for those who paid for it. The time went by so slowly. I have no idea how long I was put down there. He stopped giving me drugs and just left me there in pain. One day he came down to make love to me, as he put it, which he hasn't done since before he told me that he wanted to move. When he was done, he removed the collar, which he did once in a while to allow me to wash underneath it. I washed and got dressed and laid in bed. I must have fallen asleep because when I woke up, he was gone, but the collar was not on. I ran to the door and listened to see if I heard anybody there. I heard nothing. I opened the door and tiptoed to the front door, and my car keys were there. That meant that he was still in the house. I quietly grabbed my keys and opened the door and ran to my car. As I drove off, I looked behind me, and there he was running out the front door after me. I drove around for about an hour till I got to a McDonald's and called my mom. I told her everything, and she told me to stay there, that my stepdad was going to be on the next flight. It was at least a day before he showed up, and I just cried. I thought I was going to die there. My stepdad drove me in my car to Arizona. Lucifer had drove me all the way to Ohio. Once I got there, I moved in with my sister and went to the doctor to make sure that my health was good, and I didn't have any more drugs in my system, and to make sure that I did not have any STDs, which, thank God, I didn't and that I was okay. We contacted the police, and after years of searching for him, they still have not found him. I will always remember what happened, and I only hope that one day I can sleep without thinking that he is following me again. Throughout the years, he left notes and gifts outside my doors, and I would move. But thankfully, these last few years, I haven't gotten any. I hope that this is now the end of him, and he will never bother me again. I don't want to fear for my life, ever again. So my dad loves sharing this story that happened many years ago when I was around 5 years old or so. I'm originally from South Africa, Johannesburg, and we lived in a less dangerous neighborhood, although let's be honest, the whole country is pretty dangerous. At 5 years old, I used to have imaginary friends, but the only time I ever played with them was in the middle of the night, in the living room and in the pitch black dark. I was too small to reach the light. I think I was too young to remember details, to be honest, so all of this is from my dad and mom's side. So my dad almost every night would wake up from the ruckus, go to the living room, fetch me and put me to bed. This had become a routine and just a normal thing. One night my dad wakes up around 4 a.m. or so and hears a ruckus coming from the living room. So as normal, he gets up, groaning and stretching, and proceeds to the hallway to fetch me. Making his way down the hallway, he can hear toys and stuff being tossed around. In a tired voice, he says, "Darren, go to bed, it's 4 a.m. I called back, "What?" Except I'm not in the living room. I'm in bed still, in my bedroom behind him. So my dad, just realizing where my voice is coming from, is still hearing noises coming from the living room in front of him. He makes his way to the end of the hallway, and in the darkness, he makes out a lone silhouette. Hastily, he flicks the light switch on, and standing in front of him is this guy wearing a balaclava mask and shoving various heirlooms and picture frames into a plastic bag. The intruder and my dad stare at each other for what feels like forever. Now, this was a different time when you were allowed to shoot on sight and ask questions later. This guy drops everything and bolts out the door he pried open. We moved out of that house soon after. My nightly playtimes with my imaginary friend also stopped. I soon started to tell my mom about the old lady in the cupboard, though that's a story for another time. When my daughter was 7, she's now 15, she was shown some pretty strange visions. She's always been mature beyond her years, and the elders in the family would regularly tell me that she has definitely been here before. One day she comes and tells me about a dream she had. She starts telling me about an Egyptian princess named Princess Nefertiri. I correct her, telling her, "You mean Queen Nefertiti?" She says, "No, Mommy, it's Princess Nefertiri." I still think she's wrong at this point, but she's adamant, so I tell her to continue. She tells me that Nefertiri's daddy owned slaves and that ill treatment of the slaves made her very sad, and tears well up in my daughter's eyes. She says Nefertiri would try to talk to her father about it, but he would just yell to her and wouldn't listen, and this makes Nefertiri even sadder. I asked her what is Nefertiri's daddy's name. She said she doesn't know, but she can draw a picture of him. She draws an absolutely perfect picture of a pharaoh. I googled the name Nefertiri, and according to Google, she was the niece of Queen Nefertiti. But wait, it gets better. A couple of weeks later, she tells me about another dream. She starts to tell me about Pisden and Hades. I'm like, who? She repeats the names, pronouncing them Pisden and Hades. I tell her I don't know who she's talking about. Clearly annoyed, she says, "Yes, you do, Mommy. He's the god of the sea. He has a trident." I asked her, "Do you mean Poseidon and Hades? She gets excited and says, "Yes, that's them." She goes on to tell me all about them. Poseidon is the good brother and Hades is the bad brother. Hades wants to make humans his slaves on land and in the sea, but Poseidon wages war on his brother to stop him. Now, it's been a long time since I've read or studied any Greek mythology, probably not since high school or college, and I was around 32 at this time. So again, I googled this, and she's right on the money. Curious, I ask her, is she awake or asleep when she has these dreams? She says she's usually awake but sometimes asleep also. I tell her those aren't dreams then, they're visions. I ask her if she's scared when she has these visions. She says, "Well, some of the things I see are very scary, but I'm never afraid because the big angel is with me. He's the one that shows me the people. He writes their names in the air with his finger." Which is why she was mispronouncing Poseidon and Hades. I believe she was referring to the Archangel Michael. She said he's huge with big, beautiful wings. She asked why the big angel was showing her these things, and I tell her that I don't really know, but that it seems like he's preparing her for some kind of leadership role in the future, and showing her where past civilizations have failed so that she does not repeat their mistakes. These were the last visions she told me about. If anyone has any further insight, I welcome your input. After telling me these things, I decided to look up the meaning of her name. This is normally something I do while I'm pregnant, but she's named after my aunt, Elena, except my daughter's name is spelled Allena. I changed the spelling because her father's stepfather died a month before she was born, and his middle name was Alan. I'm a 5'1" female. A month after I started undergrad in Texas, so around September-ish of 2014, I was 18. I was walking home from class to change before driving to work. It was technically on campus, but down the road through a very busy intersection from the uni itself, when I noticed someone walking parallel to me, but about 50 feet or so apart, toward my campus apartment. I didn't think much of it and ignored the guy, until he walks up the opposing side of the stairs to the second landing, like I did. I gave that weird flat smile thing we all do when we politely pass strangers. Then he started speaking as he walked toward me. I was already at the wall beside my door at this point. "Hey, how are you?" He steps closer to me, stopping me in my tracks. "Hi, I'm good. Hope you're doing well too. I'm sorry, but I've got to go to work. Do you think we could be best friends?" "I'm sorry?" "I've been watching you, and you're really beautiful. You always walk in from the back entrance. I noticed you were coming here, and I thought I'd ask." At this point, I noticed what he looked like. He was probably 45 or so, but he was wearing what looked like teenage trends at the time. Khaki cargo shorts to his knees, a Superman emblazoned tee, a flat bill cap, long lanyard dangling from his pocket, decorative mid-calf socks, and colorful Vans. Odd for a grown man. Also, what went through my head following this was, why was a grown man in my university apartment complex? I couldn't muster up a proper response, so I let out some unintelligible, non-committal sound. "Oh, you're so pretty. I can't wait to be friends. Do you live here?" He points to my door. "Is this your room? Do you have roommates?" I give more incoherent mumbling. "Here, let me take your things for you. I can help take them in." He tries to grab my books, but I hold tight, so he puts his arm up to prop himself against the wall behind me, effectively pinning me to the wall, his body inches from mine. I smiled politely and finally managed to get something out. "I'm so sorry, I really gotta go. This friend's house. Bye." Our locks were the kind where you slide your ID in like a hotel room, so I got in quickly. "Hey, let's hang out soon. I can't wait to see you." I made it in, deadbolted the door, and cried. None of my roommates were home. I didn't know what to do. I texted my boss and said class ran late while I panicked. I decided to finally go to work, but that I would take a knife from the kitchen as self-defense as I walked to my Toyota in the parking lot, should it come down to it. This would be truck knife number 1, but truck knife number 2 is a different but little similar story. My supervisor ended up forcing me to make a police statement. I was young, embarrassed, and shy, the way a lot of girls are. I'm so thankful for you, Jeanette. She let me go without clocking out because the last thing she wanted to do was punish a victim. Long story short, at the police station, I ended up learning I was the 3rd story just like this in my building. From an RA, I learned later that this was a guy the university had hired on from a landscaping company and that he was fired. He had been trying to dress young as a sort of poor disguise to get the young girls to interact with him and let him in. None of us were hurt, but he tried to get into each of our rooms each time, the RA included. I'm so grateful for the supportive staff at my university and the campus police who believed young girls, something that doesn't seem to happen often. This happened to me about 10 years ago or so. I was 23 years old, living in a 1-bedroom apartment. I had recently moved there from another apartment complex on the other side of town, but I wanted to be closer to my brother and nephews, so I decided to move to his apartment complex. I felt safer, plus it was cheaper. Whenever I would go out with my friends, I usually left my lights on because I didn't want people to know I wasn't there. I had a TV that I didn't use, but I would occasionally watch a DVD and also had a laptop on which I would let Pandora play. Being a single female, I always made sure my door was locked and the chain latched. I was living there for several months and I went out drinking with my best friend. I came home at around 3 or 4 in the morning and passed out on my couch. I don't know how long I was asleep, but it felt like 15 to 20 minutes when I could feel myself waking up and I could see the dining room light peeking through my eyelids. My eyes sometimes open slightly while I sleep. It's weird. I could see the dining room light, but I could also see a man looking at me through my door. He was looking at me and slowly closing my door as if he knew I was about to wake up, as if I had caught him leaving my apartment. My heart was racing, but my body stayed still and my eyes would not completely open. I could see the door inching closer to its frame, and I could see his face and his hair color, but he did not look like anyone I knew. He was of average height. He had a mustache and his hair was a reddish color. Finally, I started to feel my body react to what I was seeing, and as soon as he closed the door, I jolted up, and it was as if a power surge went through my apartment. The dining room light went off, then on again, and the TV turned on to static, and my laptop, which was closed, proceeded to play Pandora. I wasn't scared though, possibly because I had awakened so abruptly. I was out of it and confused, but I definitely had sobered up after that adrenaline rush. I immediately checked my door. It was locked and latched. You can only latch the chain from the inside. I couldn't comprehend what I had just experienced, so I went to my room, locked the door, and went to sleep. I woke up around noon. I made some coffee and I proceeded to check my Facebook. There was a post that caught my eye. It was a post from my cousin which said something along the lines of, "Rest in peace, Grandpa. I know you are not in pain anymore." He had apparently passed away the night before. The thing is, I don't remember my grandpa. I have only seen a picture of him and I sitting next to each other, but I can't recall meeting him. He did have a mustache and he was bald, but the few patches of hair he did have were already white. I haven't had the chance to ask my aunt if my grandfather had brown or reddish hair. I'm not sure if my grandfather passing had any connection to do with what I had experienced hours earlier, but I like to think so. It was my sophomore year of college when I met Alex. Typical of any college student, we met after matching on Tinder. He seemed perfectly charming, and our conversations were long, yet never dull or boring. For anyone that frequently uses the Tinder dating app, you probably know how infrequent a connection like this can be. He was a few years older than me and a much more worldly individual, so I instantly became interested in him. He was an international student coming to America for his education in computer sciences, and he seemed to know a lot about computers and computer hacking. He sort of had a bad boy with a soft side of charisma to him, all of which only drew me in more. He told me all about his travels, and I told him about my much less exciting ones. Not long after matching on Tinder, we made plans to get dinner and a movie together that following weekend. When we first met, he was even more attractive and charming in person. His dark hair and soft eyes made my heart flutter in anxious excitement. One thing I first remember about meeting him was that he was noticeably quiet, which I naturally assumed was simply due to nerves. The first date overall went really well. He seemed to take an actual interest in my life, and he was an extraordinarily good listener. Not long after that night, we decided to make it official. At first, everything seemed to be going well in our relationship. In fact, things seemed to be moving much quicker than I had ever expected them to. Part of me felt as though I should be careful to not get my heart broken, but then again, there were no alarm bells going off in my head that made me think that there would be anything wrong with Alex. He texted me good night and good morning and always paid for my meals at dinner. After a few weeks of dating, I began to notice some things about Alex that just seemed off. I figured that maybe it was just me being paranoid or that I was simply falling out of the honeymoon phase, but there were some things that I just couldn't ignore. For example, he seemed overly protective of his electronics. He had multiple computers, laptops, and other technology scattered across his bedroom, and I didn't know what most of it was for. That I assumed was just a part of his computer science major and didn't really seem out of the ordinary. However, one day he went to the bathroom and left me alone in his bedroom. Out of curiosity and boredom, I aimlessly roamed around the room and picked up some of the stuff on his messy desk. I was startled when he came from seemingly out of nowhere and snapped at me for messing with his computer. I assured him that I did nothing of the sorts and was simply looking around, but promised I wouldn't touch his stuff again. I also couldn't help but notice that every computer in the room had a thick layer of tape covering the camera lens. I figured he was just the paranoid type of person when it came to computers, but it didn't stop there. The longer we were together, he became more and more controlling and seemed constantly paranoid about where I was and who I was with. Once, when I neglected to answer his phone call, he immediately came over to my apartment. Although I was out with a friend and not there at the time, my roommate answered the door for him. He demanded to know where I was. Naturally, this led to a big argument, and I seriously considered leaving him, but I realized that perhaps he was just making sure I was okay because he loved me. Unfortunately, that turned out to be very, very untrue. Our relationship quickly took a nosedive as he became extremely emotionally abusive towards me, and then even turning physically abusive. I finally came to my senses and accepted the fact that he was not the same man that I had fallen for when we first met. One Saturday, the day after an especially bad fight, I drove over to his apartment to break up with him. He greeted me at the door joyfully as I got the sinking feeling of guilt in my stomach knowing what I was about to do. I sat down on the couch with him and wasted no time getting to the point of why I had come there. In all honesty, I sort of lied about why we needed to break up. I told him something like I was too busy for a relationship and that he deserved someone better than me. He looked noticeably upset when I got the words out, and we sat together in awkward silence for a moment as I decided when the best time would be for me to get up and leave. Out of nowhere, he leaned in and tried to kiss me. Surprised, I disgustingly said, "What are you doing? We're over. Don't you get that?" In the brief moment between when he leaned in and when I protested, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. His breath reeked of alcohol, and I instantly knew that things were about to take a horrible turn. He was furious, and things instantly turned physical. To spare you the gruesome details, he drove me home after his angry outburst and left me utterly broken outside of my apartment building. The next thing I remember clearly was being in the emergency room, with my horribly upset mother sitting at my side. I sighed a breath of relief knowing that I was safe and being taken care of. For the rest of the night, I was poked, prodded, and had pictures taken of me for evidence. The whole situation was rather uncomfortable, and I was beginning to wonder when I would be allowed to go back to my cozy apartment surrounded by my roommates. Once the nurses left the hospital room I was in, my mother stood up from her seat and told me that she was going outside to call my dad and let him know that I was going to be all right. I nodded and occupied myself with the TV in my room, flipping through channels. A few minutes later, my mother came back. I turned over in bed to face her and noticed that something was clearly wrong. She looked as pale as a ghost, visibly shaken. "What is it?" I said, concerned. What she said next shook me to my core. "Alex, he's outside. He's just standing in the parking lot looking at me," my mother explained. By now, it was very late at night, and I had no intention of leaving anytime soon if he was out there waiting for me. The strangest part of this situation was that I was in a hospital outside of town, and nobody told Alex where I was. How did he find me? I later found out that he was tracking my phone and followed me to the hospital. Not long after realizing this, I got a new phone, and it was never a problem again. Thankfully, my mom notified the police officers working in the ER that night, so they kept a close eye on me, everyone entering and exiting the building. When I finally left the hospital, much to my relief, Alex was nowhere to be seen. In the end, he only tried to get in contact with me a few more times. Once he tried to get into my apartment building late at night when I wasn't there. Thankfully, my roommates were smart enough not to buzz him in. I'm not sure what he was planning that one night while waiting outside the hospital for me, but deep down I know it must have been something sinister. What bothers me the most about the situation is that he got to walk free, even after all of the evidence they took in the hospital. The case was never brought to trial. Recently, I was sharing childhood stories to my boyfriend about some of the traumatic events I went through as a child, so I thought I'd share some of them on here. Looking back, I wish that my mother and I had paid more attention to the red flags instead of choosing to ignore them. So it all started when I was around the age of 9. My mother and I would attend a Christian church often. It was a very small church, so everyone pretty much knew each other. I had a few cousins that went there, and one of them had introduced my mom to a man they knew who attended our church. At first, she wasn't interested and was kind of creeped out by him because he would follow us at church and wouldn't leave us alone, but they began talking more and started dating. Now, this guy, who we'll call Tom, seemed normal at first, but as time went on, we saw his true colors. Tom had 2 older daughters who were teenagers around the time and didn't live with him, but lived with his mother. I always found this a bit odd, but his reasoning for them not living with him was because he worked a lot, so they stayed with his mother. His daughters were always jealous of my mother and I and would constantly try to spew stuff up. For instance, at Tom's and my mother's wedding, one of them pretended to faint in front of everyone right before they were saying their I do's, and the other one claimed she was possessed by a demon, which we'll get on later in the story. Over time in my mother's marriage, we noticed how controlling and manipulating Tom was to us. But no matter what, my mom stayed because she wanted to have a father figure in my life since my biological dad left when I was 2, and I had never met him. Tom would always bully me about my weight, saying how I weighed more than my mother and that it was no good, and that I need to eat less and exercise more. Obviously, this hurt me a lot and made me so very self-conscious about myself, which made me very sad, and so Tom went to extremes and would make me take a handful of vitamins a day and controlled what I ate. He would make me eat the same thing every single day and nothing else. I would have to be in bed at 7 each night, and most of the time I would go to bed starving, so my mother would sneak me food into my room when he wasn't paying attention because of how hungry I was. Tom wouldn't let me close my door, not even to change, so I would go into my closet and change so he wouldn't be mad for me closing my door. If I was in the bathroom for too long, he would start banging on the door and yell at me to get out. I couldn't even touch the TV remote or get a paper towel to wipe my hands off. He had to do it for me because I would mess everything up. I never understood why Tom was like that, and I always tried my best to please him because nothing was ever good enough for him. He would recite the same exact Bible verses over and over each night and always had the same routine. Nothing was ever different and nothing ever could be. He was so strict about everything being perfect and would be mad if it wasn't his way. If my mom did something he didn't like, he would blow up in her face and would call her mean names, which would make me cry when I would overhear them argue all the time. There was one night when my mother and I tried leaving, but he wouldn't let us leave and blocked my mother's car so we couldn't back out. That night was terrible. He was so angry you could practically see the veins popping out of his forehead. It was traumatizing to say the least. Tom's actions were unbelievable, including his daughters. One of his daughters, who we'll call Sarah, was very overdramatic and she always had to be in the spotlight and craved so much attention. So when I was 11, the whole youth group of the church went to this church camp out in the woods. We stayed in cabins, and after getting all settled in, we headed to the main building where they held worship. As the night goes on, everyone is praying and Sarah starts breaking down and crying. Everyone goes to comfort her, and all of a sudden she drops to the floor and starts screaming. I was so terrified and thinking, what is she doing? The youth leaders started talking in tongues and started to cast this demon out of her. Everyone in the room was crying and claiming they could see it, and they opened the door to let the demon out. My 11-year-old brain didn't really know what to think. All I knew is that it was most likely nonsense and that I just wanted to leave. After that, the next night, we all sat around to talk about it, and they pretty much made the demon up as an excuse of why she would always misbehave and was scandalous, as she had sent nudes around the church to a bunch of guys and some elders had found out about it. I remember calling home and telling them that I wanted to leave, but I ended up staying the whole time. Once getting home, I told Tom what had happened, and he just said, "Uh-huh." I could tell he thought it was a bunch of nonsense as well. Time went on, and my mom and I finally left him a few months later. There's so much more to tell, but it could take forever to write out. So, Tom, you and your daughters were abusive to my mother, and I hope that you get a bite of karma. This is a shorter story, but nonetheless still quite chilling. My family owns a pretty isolated cabin in northern Minnesota. It pretty much fits all the criteria for being in northern Minnesota. Long, cold, snowy winters and surrounded by acres and acres of woods. With our nearest neighbor being about 1.5 acres away, it's easy to feel quite alone and isolated back in the woods. Aside from rational fears like the numerous wolf and bear sightings, I have also been quite afraid of a crazed drifter walking through the woods and eventually ending up at my cabin and slaughtering my family. However, between these two fears, rational and irrational, I had never thought a third option could actually occur: a visit from the paranormal. One cabin trip, everything had gone as it usually does, except for this one night. A fan of all things vintage, my family often enjoys nights in the back garage watching old movies on the VCR. My dad and sister sit by the TV at our large collapsible poker table as my brother and I lay on a bed, half falling asleep as sounds of the 1987 Predator lulls us to bed. The room we're in used to just be a cluttered back room we never used, but since we had spent that summer cleaning it out and decorating it with various World War II and old Indian artifacts, we had begun using it much more. We usually only use it in warmer months, however, as it is not meant to be used as a room and is not insulated. My eyes open and close every few minutes as I grow more and more tired. Sure, I was not going to finish the movie. My younger brother next to me shares the same problem as I, falling deeper and deeper asleep with every minute the movie goes on. I finally begin waking up and sleeping in short intervals and just fall asleep, Not caring I was in this cold back room, I was too tired to move, which was a big mistake. If I could go back in time and finish that movie, I would have gotten up and gone into the main cabin to fall asleep. Hours later, in the middle of the night, not sure exactly what time because I had no phone or clock, I awoke in a daze. Knowing I was falling asleep but angered my dad or sister hadn't woken up my brother and I to go to our usual beds, I lay there for a minute or two trying to remember what had happened prior to my falling asleep. Suddenly I realized something was off. There was someone watching me. I looked up to the doorway leading into the main cabin to see a man's figure just standing there. It looked as if a light was on behind this man's silhouette, and he was just standing, watching. I was certain there was someone there. Not totally awakened and alarmed, I began to call out. "Dad?" I called to the figure. "Megan?" I yelled for my sister, though I was sure it was a man. Nothing changed, however. He just stood, not moving or responding, just standing. 30 minutes or so had passed and he was still there. Hoping it was just my dad or my sister, I had continued calling out to it every so many minutes, waiting for it to move or at least do something. Suddenly, it did do something. Disappeared. Like a light being shut off, it suddenly just vanished into the darkness. I wasn't sure where it went. Into the cabin, by me or nowhere at all, I felt frightened but also quite tired suddenly. Next thing I knew, I had fallen asleep again. Morning came and I slowly began to remember all the memories from last night. That man, who was he? Maybe it was my dad or sister after all. I walked into the main cabin and began describing it and questioning them over breakfast, and they both agreed it wasn't either of them that had oddly stood watching while my brother and I slept. It was then my brother revealed to me that he had awoken to me calling out various names and had also seen the spirit. Creeping me out, but also assuring me it had been real, I was not just seeing things, I used it as leverage to convince my dad that I had really seen something, but it was clear he didn't believe me. Months later, my dad, older brother, my uncles, and my older brother's dog went back up to the cabin for duck hunting season. With lots of people there, my older brother ended up sleeping in that back room with his dog. Since my father didn't believe my brother or I from the prior months, I'm sure he failed to mention the ghost experience I had had. Hours later, the men in their beds and my older brother settling into his bed in the back room with his trusty hunting dog, they began to fall asleep. Suddenly, in the middle of the night, my brother was awoken by the sound of his dog barking. Standing near the doorway, howling away at the figure of a man, just standing. Yelling and calling out to it, just like I had, my brother awaited the figure to do something, but just like before, it did nothing. Unlike before, however, this time when the spirit left, instead of disappearing into thin air, it turned and walked into the main cabin, leaving my brother confused and a bit shaken in the dark room. Upon morning's return, he too questioned the men, demanding to know why they had stood in the doorway just watching. But yet again, everyone was in denial. It hadn't been any of them. And finally, my dad believed the story. With now 3 accounts of the doorway spirit and a dog bark to confirm it, it seemed like we had a ghost in the cabin. To this day, neither of my brothers or I have slept out there again. Whether it was my grandpa stopping by to check in, a distant relative admiring my dad's work to clean out that back room, or a spirit attached to one of the old artifacts, we may never know. While that room has been smudged and others have slept there with no morning spirit reports, I can assure you I will not be sleeping out there anytime soon. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Be sure to subscribe and click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. If you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/letsreadofficial, and give and receive feedback from the community, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. and join my Discord to interact with me and other listeners directly. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations for just $1 a month on Patreon, and maybe even pick up some Let's Read merch on Spreadshirt. Links in the bio. Thanks so much, friends, and may your socks stay buttery.